Good evening and welcome everyone to Tech Talks, the virtual series designed to provide technical assistance to residents interested in learning more about Glynn County Superfund sites. I'm your host, Rachel Thompson. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All microphones and cameras will stay off until we reach the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. In the meantime, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat and we will go through each one during the Q&A session. Tech Talks are brought to you by the Glynn Environmental Coalition, a nonprofit environmental health and environmental justice advocacy organization. The Glynn Environmental Coalition was founded by a group of concerned citizens in 1990, wanting to know how our community became so polluted, why we continue to have health-threatening levels of pollution, and how an action plan could be developed to correct the problem. The fact that you're listening in today means that you share the concern and the interest of our founding members, and we're extremely grateful for your participation. Today, the Glynn Environmental Coalition is presenting episode 4 in our virtual series. In our earlier episodes, we discussed what a Superfund site is and how the law that governs Superfund sites came into existence. We have also covered the key steps in the Superfund decision-making process. And most recently, we did a deep dive into the mercury contamination at the LCP Chemical Superfund site. If you haven't seen them, be sure to visit our website, glynenvironmental.org/Superfund, to listen and learn. Today, we'll be talking about the Hercules II Landfill Superfund Site. More specifically, we're going to share where the site's located and provide a brief site history. Then we will present an overview of the current cleanup activities and environmental concerns. As we go through the presentation, we'll do our best to define keywords and terms that are used in the Superfund process. If there are any words that you would like us to define, please let us know by commenting in the chat. You can also find definitions for keywords by visiting the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund glossary. The website is shown at the bottom of the screen. The Hercules II Landfill Superfund Site is located in a commercial residential area along the east side of the Golden Isles Parkway, north of Benedict Road and south of the Nally Automotive dealership. This image doesn't provide a great view, so let's take a closer look. In the clip, you can see the Superfund site property highlighted in yellow with the Golden Isles Parkway or the spur along the left. To the right of the property, you can see Beverly Villas, recently built in 2022. Above that is the Glynn County Board of Education property, or where Altama Elementary was formerly located. You can also see the Legacy apartment complex and a currently undeveloped forested parcel adjacent to the northeastern boundary of the Superfund site. Remember that location because we'll be discussing it again later. Initially, the site was home to a borrow pit, or an area created to remove sediments for use in another location. The sediments were used to line the roadbed in the development of the Golden Isles Parkway, also known as the Spur 25. From 1948 to the early 1980s, Hercules manufactured toxaphene, a carcinogenic pesticide now banned in the U.S., at its Brunswick facility located near Highway 17 in the St. Simons Island Causeway. From 1976 to 1980, Hercules operated a permitted industrial landfill near the former borrow pit, about 3 miles from the Brunswick manufacturing plant. Wastewater, sludge, and other manufacturing waste were dumped into 6 lined cells until the Georgia Environmental Protection Division canceled Hercules' landfill permit. You can see the landfill cells on the image here. Wastewater, sludge, and other manufacturing waste were dumped into the 6 lined cells until the Georgia Environmental Protection Division canceled Hercules' landfill permit and required closure of the landfill. Poor disposal practices at the site resulted in soil, surface water, and groundwater contamination. As the name of the site suggests, Hercules Incorporated is the potentially responsible party. The EPA considers the potentially responsible party as any individual or company responsible for a spill or other contamination at Superfund sites. In some cases, a company can inherit the liability through purchasing or consolidating corporate assets, meaning they become responsible for environmental cleanup without actually contributing to environmental pollution at the site. And you can find that definition at the EPA Superfund glossary I mentioned earlier. So where are we in the Superfund process? This is one of the images that we like to share to help citizens understand where we are in the Superfund process. And again, we have another video, episode 2, that talks about each one of these steps in the process. So as you can see, Hercules 009 Landfill Superfund Site, we are all the way into the cleanup and monitoring phase of the Superfund process. So cleanup activities that have happened to date: in 1991, alternate water supplies were provided to nearby properties on Benedict Road and Nix Lane. So that was very recently after the Superfund site was designated. Back in 1984, it was initially designated. And due to some of the concerns with the groundwater contamination and an understanding that it was going to take a while for them to understand and address those issues, the EPA put forth a record of decision that required the nearby properties to get access to municipal water. In 1998, again, going through that Superfund process, there was an effort to contain soil contamination on site through in situ stabilization. And you can see an example of that in the picture to the left. You can see there's an excavator that is putting an auger or a mixer, and there is a binding agent. Oftentimes, it's very similar to grout or a cement type mixture, and they're mixing it into the ground and solidifying the soil. And so when they did that, they created a what they consider a monolith, which is essentially a cement monolith underground that prevents any of the contamination from moving via wind or water erosion, or the chemicals getting suspended in the groundwater through like rain. So that was all in 1998. And then in 2005, they leased the land to Nally Automotive Dealership that we mentioned is on the northern side of the property. And they constructed an asphalt parking lot. And this is actually a picture I pulled from the GEC archives of that process. And you can see as they were working through the process of building this asphalt, they had a part of the soil looked like it was kind of eroding off of, this is the former landfill that had been covered and stabilized. But you can see the area where the rocks are is where the parking lot now is. And if you look at any recent pictures or you live in the area, you know exactly what that parking lot looks like. There's lots of vans and trucks and things on that parking lot. Historically, the benzene concentrations at the easternmost permanent groundwater monitoring well, or well N5, which is located right here, northeast end of the site, have fluctuated above the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, which is the maximum level allowed of a pollutant in drinking water. To determine the eastern perimeter of benzene plume that they detected at monitoring well N5, the EPA requested that Hercules conduct more investigations on the adjacent property, which is this property right here. I mentioned earlier we were going to be talking about this property again today. In September 2010, Hercules installed temporary wells and collected 26 groundwater samples from shallow temporary wells and 12 samples from deep temporary wells. Sampling results found benzene concentrations exceeding the maximum contaminant level in 10 wells. And you can see, and I know it's not a great picture. This one's pretty old, an older graph, but still relevant. You can have exceeds MCL, and that MCL again is the maximum contaminant level, and it's 5 micrograms per liter. And then you can see all of these 6 samples. Actually, it looks like it's 7. So 24, 240. So that's pretty high. 240, that's pretty high if the maximum contaminant level is 5. Hercules provided a sampling report and recommended installing permanent confirmatory monitoring wells. So again, these initial wells were just temporary. East of N5, we go back to here, that's over here. So that was the sampling results recommended that they were going to install permanent wells east of N5 to monitor benzene levels and any potential migration. Hercules pursued obtaining access from the owner for permanent wells and was unsuccessful in this effort. Hercules did notify the EPA that they were unable to reach an agreement with the property owner to install these wells, and EPA agreed that Hercules should continue with the current monitoring program. And essentially, that was in about 2010, 2011. And so Hercules continued monitoring the wells that were on site. And so we were able to collect this data, and you can see this is that well N5. You have the MCL down here, which is that 5 micrograms per liter. And even though it fluctuates greatly, it goes really high up here. This is around 2012. And you can see they're monitoring just about looks like about twice a year and sometimes once a year, just depending. But it does stay above the MCL. In 2019, Hercules was granted access to the eastern adjoining property so that they could facilitate some off-site groundwater monitoring. So again, all of the data up until around 2019, going into 2020, was all on site. It was all on site at the Superfund site. So in 2021, we had our first off-site groundwater monitoring report that was released, which showed a contour, which is this bright green line. And it was an estimation of where they believe the benzene or the plume was underground. So you can see that in green. And so you can see the N5 here, and right next to it you have the benzene reading, and here that's 36. That'd be micrograms per liter. You have N18, 190. The point of this really is that this was all new information. We were learning new information about this part of the site. Which brings us to where we are right now. So again, this was 2021. We've had a number of documents that have been released since then, and there's really been a lot going on at the site. So as a result of some of the higher levels of benzene that they found off-site, Hercules opted to facilitate something called Petrofix injections. Petrofix is an activated carbon fluid designed to remediate dissolved contaminants, including benzene. And I'm going to play this video.
Introducing Petrofix, a powerful new remediation fluid for the treatment of petroleum hydrocarbons. Leaks from underground storage tanks can result in high levels of petroleum hydrocarbons impacting the underlying groundwater. This can lead to human health risks through vapor production and environmental risks to receptors on and off-site. Petrofix is a water-based suspension of micron-scale activated carbon and electron acceptors. It is non-hazardous and safe to use, requiring only dilution and mixing on site. The activated carbon suspension is easily injected into the subsurface under low pressure. Injection can use direct push, wells, or placement into excavation.
So after the Petrofix injections, and that started again in 2022, June to August 2022, the groundwater monitoring inspection assessment and pilot test report was released in November 2023, and that detailed monitoring that took place following the injections, so post-injection performance monitoring, and then also it included some of their annual groundwater monitoring as well. Groundwater sampling events conducted in November 2022 and August 2023 were comprehensive and included the full components of wells that were sampled at the site on an annual basis. And then additional monitoring was conducted in February 2023 and May 2023. And those were specifically near wells that were situated in the immediate vicinity of where they injected the Petrofix. And you can see the graph here that shows the trends going back to June 2020 through 21, 2022, and 2023 that are showing a gradual decrease in some of the benzene concentration levels. You can see some of the lower level wells, like this is performing very well. And then this guy right here, this N25, this was one you can see it doesn't have data prior to 2022. So that means they just installed that one. That's a newer well. And it shows an increase, but then a decrease. And so right now, the results, as I mentioned, are trending downward. And this is something that we, the Glynn Environmental Coalition, are going to be watching to make sure that it continues to be successful. And I'm not sure as of right now if they're going to continue to do any more injections. I'm not sure if they have even figured that out. But they're monitoring that right now. Okay, and then most recently, this is not necessarily work that's going on at the site, but is important for consideration. And one of the reasons that the Glynn Environmental Coalition is still actively monitoring and providing community involvement at the site. There was a rezoning application that was tentatively approved by the Glynn County Board of Commissioners, and that was in August of 2023, so just around this time last year. And you can see the language. This is taken from the minutes of that Glynn County Board of Commissioners meeting. It says a motion was made by Commissioner Alan Booker and seconded by Commissioner Walter Rafalski to approve the rezone, and that would be rezoning from general commercial district to medium residential. And there is about, I believe, at least 60 proposed units on this site. And there was a clarification that was put on the zoning approval, which was before building permits were issued for the site. Clarification should be received from the EPA on whether the Superfund site has been capped and if there's any leakage on the current property of the Superfund site. And then it says the motion passed. So since then, Hercules has also looked at some vapor intrusion, but the November 2023 report that I mentioned earlier does talk about activity and use limitations on the adjoining parcel. And it says activity and usage limitations on the adjoining parcel, which is 240 Merchants Way. In order to maintain protectiveness, it should include requirements for vapor barriers beneath buildings and lining of any planned stormwater retention ponds and groundwater usage restrictions. And they're requiring or suggesting an environmental covenant to memorialize these requirements. So essentially that is where they are in the process of that. Adjacent property is putting a universal environmental covenant, and what that is, and I just looked up the state of Georgia's definition. That actually wasn't in the EPA Superfund glossary, even though it's a tool that's very often used in the Superfund cleanup process when any contaminants or pollutions left behind. Certain properties that have been designated as needing cleanup due to the presence of hazardous waste or hazardous substances. In some instances, a uniform environmental covenant or a UEC is implemented to protect public and environment from exposure to substances that remain in the soil, the groundwater. This is accomplished through permanent controls and restrictions on property usage. So essentially what this would look like for the adjacent property would be something that would live with the deed of the property, that would restrict you from putting in drinking water wells, digging to certain depths. You know, they're not going to allow them to dig probably beyond, 10 or 15 feet because they have found some benzene concentrations at some shallow depths. And then, as it mentioned, making sure that they have vapor intrusion barriers in any of the buildings and on the stormwater ponds. And that is something that there's a lot of technology that exists around vapor intrusion. And I didn't mention it earlier, but the reason why benzene, especially when we're talking about residential development, one of the pictures in that Petrofix slide, it shows like the benzene as it comes closer to the surface, it can vaporize and you can breathe it in. And benzene is a known carcinogen. So we want to make sure that if people are living on that property, that vapor intrusion technology is put in place so that they are protected from any potential exposure to benzenes. And that concludes our 4th episode of our Tech Talks. You can see the contact information on the screen. Please feel free to call us or email us if you have any questions about the material presented here in our other Tech Talk episodes, or any general questions about Glynn County's Superfund sites or hazardous waste sites. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day.